Wominjeka, welcome in the language of the Kulin Nation, whose traditional lands we're meeting upon today. I'm born on Dja Dja Wurrung country and live here in Melbourne on Wurundjeri country. I too would like to pay my respects to elders past and present of the Kulin Nation, and also to acknowledge and welcome elders of all communities who are with us today for this conversation, We Sell This City. So, to my left we have Amanda, and then Megan, and then Adele. I'm not going to go through their bios in details because you've probably already read those on the State Library website, and we've only got an hour and 10 minutes or so to talk. So I think rather than run through everybody's bios and their awards and their skills and specialities, if you need to know a little bit more about those later, as I said, you can find them on the State Library website. But we're going to talk today, as we know, about advertising and its role in representation and how advertising can sell a city and represent a city's people, and indeed the peoples of Australia and abroad as well. So I'm going to throw things straight to Amanda, who's going to begin with a brief introduction and a few images.
Great, thank you. Thanks everyone. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview of the Charles Trudell collection here at the State Library Victoria, which was part of my creative fellowship project, which I began last year and I'm still working on. So for those that don't know, Charles Trudell was a printer and lithographer and founder of the firm Trudell & Co, and is referred to as essentially the grandfather of Australian lithography, and was really influential in creating a lot of early advertising material in Melbourne. So he was born in Hamburg but came to Australia in 1860, and he was apprenticed at Shawcroft's printing establishment. He worked there for a few years and then he set up his own printing firm. So some of you may be familiar with the Melbourne album. That was his first work. It was a 24 print edition of landscapes of various vantage points across Melbourne, and it was considered a success. He printed that over a couple of years, but the real success of his business was the commercial printing enterprise, and that started very shortly thereafter. The business survived for 150 years in the Trudell name. Some of them are here today. It was only in the last couple of years that that business came to an end. But the reason why the business endured for so long and why the Trudell name is so successful was because of this commercial printing and advertising arm of the business. The archive that's here at the State Library of Victoria is essentially an archive which maps all of the works that were produced and came out of the Trudell printing business. And it traces all the way back to the 1870s and 80s, and those are some of the images that are on display here today. And the preservation and the archive is basically, it's the product of one man's meticulous record keeping, Arthur Hewitt. And he kept all of the items that came off the run, and those items count to almost 10,000 individual specimens. And they're all here in the Trudell collection, thanks to the very kind donation of the Trudell family. So I was lucky enough to have a look at that, and hopefully you'll get to have a look at some of that today as well. The archive is really quite remarkable. Trudell was noted in his time for the quality of his work, so he won a number of international awards at the international exhibitions. He worked and collaborated with a number of really prominent artists at the time, Francis Cognier, Nicolas Chevalier, and also Arthur Streeton. Arthur Streeton was one of his apprentices before he went on to work with the Heidelberg School. The archive for me as a legal historian is really fascinating because it provides a really interesting snapshot of 19th century Australia, but particularly Melbourne, and it speaks to the sorts of cultural norms and social trends of the time. It's also really significant because it dossiers Australia's very, very earliest advertising, and it really provides a history of Australian print advertising. And it was critical at the time because his business and some of these early works are some of the first kind of graphic advertisements. And we saw this shift from text-based advertising, classified advertising, to really graphical print advertising. And the Trudell collection really dossiers that. Now, I was asked today to select a number of items for you to have a look at. Some of them are on display. It was a very painful exercise, just trying to select a few items to showcase the beauty of the archive. But this image here is probably, maybe, one of my favourites. So some of you might remember Foy and Gibson. They were one of Australia's or one of Melbourne's early department stores, but they also manufactured, so they sold lots of different goods, but they also manufactured some goods, and their factory was based out in Collingwood, so the buildings are still there at the moment. So this is an image that was printed by Trodel. We don't know by who. It might have been by Robert Wendell, who was one of his chief collaborators, and it was produced in around the 1880s. It's undated, we don't know. But of that particular era, this is quite typical, really, of the sorts of styles of advertising posters and labels that are part of the collection. And the thing about this image, but also the other images in the collection, is it really says something about Melbourne at the time and the way that people and the brands and the businesses in Melbourne saw themselves, and also the way that they wanted to present themselves to the world as well. So this image here, it kind of plays on all of the stereotypes that we have to explain to our overseas friends. It's the hot Australian Christmas in the arid terrain. It's the crazy man on an emu. I think there might be some other animals. There's probably a kangaroo in the background, but it's the hot terrain. But it also sort of speaks to the Australian sensibility and sense of humour as well. And a lot of these prints are quite humorous, and they show that kind of sense of humour as well, but also that the Australians don't take themselves so seriously. But if you look at the quality, I mean, the images here are beautiful, the texture and the tone and the colour, and this is really important at the time because, as I said, we see a sort of shift from black and white textural kind of advertising to these magnificent works of art. So hopefully you get to have a look at this, the real hard copy version over on the tables over there, and some of the other beautiful items in the collection.
Megan, over to you, as we fast forward through a couple of images.
Good afternoon, thank you. In 1986, Frank Firestone donated his collection of intricate embossed show cards to the SLV. He was an immigrant from Germany, and I was fortunate enough in 2015 to undertake a creative fellowship here at the library. It was a staff fellowship. People ask what show cards are. They're used by iconic companies for advertising and promotion from the 1920s till about the 1980s. And this collection displays examples at the time of new manufacturing techniques, graphic design and typography. The Feuerstein Company, W.S. Feuerstein, was founded in 1890 in Dresden by Wolf Feuerstein. They were involved in printing and lithographics before World War I. Wolf's son Leon and grandson Franz were considered to be the first people to develop the process of embossing in the 1920s. Becoming a world leader in their field, they exported their show cards internationally and employed over 300 people. Following the rise of the Nazi Party, the factory in Dresden was seized. The brothers Franz and Gerhard escaped to England, but Leon, his wife, and daughter Susie did not survive the war. The factory and archive was completely destroyed in the Allied bombing of Dresden in 1945. After travelling to Australia on the Dunera ship as prisoners of war, Franz and Gerhard were recognised as refugees and spent time in the internment camps in Hay and Tatura. They eventually settled in Melbourne, and in 1943, Franz married Rose. In 1947, upon learning of the death of his father, mother and sister, Franz Wolfgang Feuerstein changed his name to Frank Wilfred Firestone, and with £100 from Rose's family, he bought a modified machine to start his father's business again in Port Melbourne. Frank's children joined the business, and we're fortunate to have Tom and Walter with us today. This unique collection of over 760 show cards is of significant historical, social and aesthetic significance because of its provenance, rarity and pristine condition. 348 of the cards were produced in Germany before World War II and only survived because of a sample archive kept by the Australian company's representative in Australia, Henry H. York & Co. And you can see here samples of existing German designs that would be sent to Australia, modified to the Australian market, and then produced for Australian products. This is quite an interesting one for a Kubra. The collection represents over 450 companies, including the industries of clothing and textiles, footwear, banking, alcoholic beverages, cosmetics and tobacco. The 215 Australian companies represented chart the social narrative of Victoria and advertising trends for over 60 years. The companies represented occupied many significant Melbourne buildings, and images of the factories were caught in iconic photographs by Wolfgang Sievers, of which some are in the State Library Victoria's collection. Designers of show cards also include Sidney Nolan and Gerhard Hurst, who was also a refugee from Dresden. So here you can see the number of Australian companies represented, and most of them are instantly recognisable. These are Bedgood shoes, and you can see some images of Wolfgang Sievers there. Black Lance Swimwear, again with their factory was in Coburg. Crest Knit. Dunlop Bow Repair, again with some more images from Sievers of the factories. Fairfield Hats, which was a company that produced all the slouch hats for the diggers in World War I and World War II. Sidney Nolan was, when he was 16, worked for the company doing advertising boards. Hilton Hosiery, another well-known name. Holeproof. Lucas, which the factory was based in Ballarat, and during the war, it was mainly women who were employed there, went from making silk stockings to silk parachutes, and fundraised to build the famous arch in Ballarat and helped to plant the trees in the Avenue of Honour when you drive down the main street of Ballarat. Sutex was another major brand. ICI, AWA Radiola, Nestle's, or Nestle, Senate's Ice Cream, which was a famous ice cream brand last century. We all know this one, Cadbury. This is interesting because this one has cards which were made both in Germany and then later post-war in Australia. Kiwi Shoe Polish, which a fantastic image again from Sievers of the factory. And General Motors Holden. So that's the amazing collection that I've become slightly obsessed with.
Thank you, Megan. Adele.
Thank you. Just to give you a brief background about actual size, I'm the co-founder, and we're a creative agency based in Collingwood. We've got about 20 years experience working in events and have a real kind of commitment to working with individuals or organisations that really contribute to the social fabric of Melbourne. I'm here today to talk about the work we've done with Triple R. Can I get a sense from the audience who knows Triple R? Fair few, okay. It's true that Triple R is very well loved. So so we've been working with Triple R for 10 years now. So half of our business life has been dedicated to working with Triple R. For those of you who don't know Triple R, it's a Melbourne-based independent radio station. There are about 440,000 listeners each week. There are about 16,000 subscribers that keep the radio station on air. So all of those generous individuals that donate each year basically keep the station running. And with with the exception of the Breakfasters, which is the kind of drive time morning program, it's entirely, all of the programs are entirely run by volunteers. And I'm here to talk to you about the Radiothon campaign that we do annually for Triple R, which is to, I guess, encourage subscribers, either existing or new subscribers, to donate. And there's a very sort of, I guess, a kind of, like a basic message with the campaign, and it kind of drills down to Melbourne Independent Radio and Subscribe. There are some, I guess, kind of creative challenges with the campaign. Triple R have been on air for 40 years, so I guess Triple R means different things to different people. So depending on when you've started listening, it really does kind of mean something quite different to you. And as a consequence, Triple R's got an audience base from, I don't know, 5 to into the 60s, 70s. The other challenge with Radiothon is independent is something that can be really difficult to sort of visually depict. So that creates a kind of challenge with the campaign. I guess the biggest challenge with this campaign is, how do you encourage someone to subscribe when they can listen for free? So we're intrinsically trying to encourage people to spend money when they don't really need to. The creative approach, and I am generalising, in the Radiothon campaign is there's various examples on the walls. One of the creative approaches that we've done in the past is to really subvert commercial advertising culture, and by way of using, I guess, commercial culture, we're using that as a sort of counterpoint, and really, I guess, emphasising independent by making Triple R different. The other technique that we've utilised is we work with a number of young or early career illustrators or creatives or craftspeople that have skills perhaps of the past, and I think the campaign has been really successful of the last few years, because it shows a really kind of it shows a care and a detail that I guess current advertising culture doesn't contain. If you look at advertising at the moment, it's a lot of it is very kind of fast and slick, whereas we utilise a lot of hand skills, a lot of care, a lot of detail. The illustrations are amazingly detailed, and I think that something that we've always used as a judge of whether the campaign is successful, it's something in the studio that we call floggability. So if we see that a poster's been torn down, it's such a nod to how good we think the campaign is. So basically, if you've got a rock poster up on a wall and it's been torn down, we think that we've done a good campaign. And yeah, it takes some time after the talk and have a look at the campaigns. There's we've worked on 10 years of Radiothon for Triple R, and it's lovely to sort of see that as part of the State Library collection now.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to throw a quote at all three of you and ask you to respond to it. US advertiser Leo Burnett once said, "The work of an advertising agency is warmly and immediately human. It deals with human needs, wants, dreams and hopes. Its product cannot be turned out on an assembly line." To what extent do the Firestone, Trodel and Triple R advertising campaigns and collections deal and manifest human dreams and hopes rather than just selling a brand or selling a product?
Shall we start here, maybe? Well, I think Trodel's collection absolutely is a perfect example of advertising that didn't come out of a production line. So the early ads and some of the things that we're showing you here came about in a time before advertising agencies, before focus groups. It's really authentic. And they had an art department with a whole lot of very, very talented artists, which I think created these really genuine pieces that spoke to consumers and were kind of untainted by these other objectives and motivations, perhaps. So of that particular era, this is why I think the collection is so significant as well, because it emerged in a time when these very, very early ads are really quite pure, and they're very, very different to the sorts of things that are being produced today.
Yeah, the Triple R collection, I think that we're not specifically selling a product, we really are selling a lifestyle. And whilst I mentioned it is difficult to quantify independent, we really are creating a sense of community and spirit. And I think that part of the success of the campaign is how unifying that is. So I think at its core there's a desire to distinguish from contemporary advertising culture, and what the audience sees in the Triple R campaigns is a different path. It's an alternate lifestyle. It's something that I guess is at its core maybe a little rebellious.
I think with the Firestone collection, what's unique about that is the show cards used to sit on store counters. So you'd see billboards and print advertising, and you would encounter these at the point of purchase. And they are such beautiful things, the colours, topography in them. I think as a point of sale purchase, they're such beautiful things that when I saw them, I would immediately want to have that pair of stockings. Or I think that's the beauty of those, that they provide. They're a beautiful piece of advertising. So.
That notion of beauty is something that really interests me, because we've heard from each of you that artists have played a part, whether it's young designers and young artists or young makers. There's a beautiful Triple R campaign from a couple of years ago with cardboard cutout models kind of assembled and put together, for example. So there's that bespoke artistic nature. There's also, as we've heard, kind of the young Streeton as an apprentice at Trodel, of a young Sydney Nolan at Firestone. How important and how significant have those artists been in the development of campaigns?
Yeah, I can kick off. Having worked with Triple R for 10 years, part of keeping that campaign fresh has really been, I think, it's really down to working with artists that see things differently. And because a lot of them have been younger or early career artists or illustrators, there's a nuance that they bring to the campaign. It's a freshness, it's a different way of seeing things. So I guess even though the campaign each year is still selling the same message, we are appearing to to transition. So Triple R evolves, and there's no stagnation. So I think that part of that that sort of nubile quality of a young artist or an early career artist is really important.
That was very much the approach of Trodel as well. Streeton and Cognier and others cut their teeth with him in the art department. These were new and emerging artists that hadn't yet developed their reputation. So it's interesting that it's sort of come full circle, but because they've come with these fresh ideas, they're uninhibited and not tainted, for want of a better word, it does create a real sort of fresh, new and really distinct kind of catalogue of work.
And I think also with artists, they were part of a bigger organisation as well. So graphic design is such a big industry now, but back then it was artists and illustrators who weren't. It was sort of subsumed in the whole role of producing this end thing rather than a designer as we see them nowadays. So I think that's an interesting thing to look at as well.
It's also interesting that they're young artists and young designers who they may bring fresh ideas, but they also haven't established their own ideas. So perhaps, do you think they were perhaps more malleable and more easily adaptable to a particular style, a house style, as opposed to being an established artist going, no, I will do it like this?
Possibly that's true, particularly with some of the early advertising posters in the Trodel collection in the 1880s and 1890s. So that was emerging at the time when the French art poster movement had developed as well, and also using chromolithography, so layering colour onto prints. And you'll see that a lot of those posters actually mimic some of those styles and the European artists of the time, so that might have actually played into that as well.
I think there's a lovely example over there which you can see of, it's a very distinctly Bauhaus design for a camera in Germany. So I think the Time really influenced the style of design. You can track that through the topography as well. So I think that's an interesting way to sort of chart the collection.
And as well as being of the time, something else that connects all three of the different collections we're talking about is a sense of place. There's a real sense of whether it's a contemporary independent Melbourne identity for Triple R, for example, or the awareness of an emerging Australian identity in the 1800s, or the Melbourne that featured in the 30s and 40s, for example, whether it be the rag trade in Flinders Lane or whatever. So talk to us about the sense of place that these collections and these campaigns typify and embody, and how they represent Melbourne. What do they show us about a Melbourne that perhaps we would be missing if these collections didn't exist?
In regard to the Firestone collection, it's a multi-layered collection. The stories behind the actual object are really part of the importance of the collection. I think part of my research was to look at the companies represented and then where they existed in Melbourne and how many people they employed. There was one company in Coburg that introduced a nurse for women who were coming to work after the war to help with their children. So there was a daycare centre. All the factories that were built, very significant buildings around Melbourne, chart that history as well. So the stories that these cards don't obviously tell really do chart the social history of Melbourne from about the 20s through to the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, the Triple R campaigns, I feel like, because they're contemporary, it almost some time will have to pass before we can kind of see how it reflects on the Melbourne-ness of them. They're very much about kind of, urban Melbourne culture, which it does have. There's a global sort of design aesthetic. I think that it's very distinctly Melbourne, but I think there's more of a kind of tinge of independent culture, so a sort of subset of life than necessarily the emphasis on Melbourne per se.
The Trodal collection, I think, a lot like your collection, there are lots of stories behind each of the individual works and the companies and the brands that are being represented. One interesting element or part of the collection that really sort of spoke to the time was theatre posters. So Trodal produced a number of theatre posters, and Wendell was one of the artists that seemed to produce quite a number of those. Around the 1880s and 1890s, and that was kind of the golden era of theatre in Melbourne. And you really get an insight into this sort of emergence of leisurely pursuits and how people spent their weekends, and this kind of European culture that was infiltrating into Melbourne, where it's really becoming something. They were bringing out international artists and plays from overseas, and you can see that story through the theatre posters particularly. And there are lots of, that's just one example, but there are lots and lots of stories that you can track through these catalogues, which I think there are stories within stories, which makes it so exciting actually to research.
If we're thinking of a very distinctly Melbourne identity, I mean, this poster here over to the audience's right, the Kick It To Ours, kind of is...
It's a WEG illustration. Unfortunately, WEG passed away some years ago, so we don't have the beautiful WEG football posters. But yeah, no, I mean, he's, you know, institutional, really. It's so very, very Melbourne. Yeah.
And although it's from 2005, it's still then clearly referencing and echoing decades of history beforehand. So we perhaps don't have to wait too many decades to...
Yeah, I think, I mean, WEG was very, very established as an illustrator when we worked with him on that illustration. It felt like we were sort of repurposing a very sort of understood visual aesthetic. So yeah, I think that, I mean, there's definitely a kind of like a parochial Melbourne feel in a lot of WEG's work. And I think that, I mean, if you think he would have been in his late 60s when he illustrated that piece. So we're talking about a completely different generation of illustrator than some of the pieces up the back, definitely.
Now, a question for Amanda and Megan. Both Trodal and Firestone are successful immigrant stories, which is something that heartens me in an era in which anti-immigrant sentiments seem to be on the rise. But my politics aside, I wondered whether you think that because of that, the immigrant aspect, what that gave them in sense of being able to look at Australian culture and society with an outsider's eye. Did they see something in Australia? Did their companies show something in Australia that perhaps Australians may not have seen?
I definitely think so with the Firestone collection. I mentioned the internment camps at Hay and Tatura, which were full of musicians and artists and designers, mainly from Germany, and a lot of them from the schools of art in Germany. So I think that was a really big influence, not just from this collection, but architecture and writing and the arts in general. I think it was a huge influence on Australia and really made Australian design and branding and advertising what it became. It was because of that. Yes.
I think the migrants part of the story actually is really interesting as well with the Trodal collection. Trodal trained and was apprenticed in Europe, and lithography is a very European invention, and yet he came to Australia and carved out a career in Melbourne to do so. And I think looking back, probably he may never have been able to achieve the kind of success in business that he would have if he was in a very tightly and highly competitive European environment. In the colonies, particularly I think in Victoria at the time, we're starting to see consumer culture and consumption, and so there was a real market and a need for the production of this kind of advertising and print material, and he was highly trained and skilled in this particular method of printing. And in the colonies as well, there weren't the same kind of legal restrictions around the use of this technology as it was in Europe, and so that, and also, you know, this sort of idea that the colonies were a little bit more free-spirited it and experimental, and you could take risks and experiment a little bit more, I think is a really significant kind of aspect to the story. He was a real entrepreneur and possibly would never have been able to, as I said, take those risks and branch out in the way that he did here.
Now, Megan, embossing, it seems to have dropped out of fashion.
I think it's because of the expense. If you look at the collection of Firestone, the quantities that were produced post-war in Australia were huge, and then it dropped off in the 80s. But the company that took over the Firestone company, Avon Graphics, is still in existence. And we were talking before.
Yeah, they're highly reputable. I mean, if you're going to do any foiling in our industry, they would definitely be the go-to.
Yeah, there's a guy in the factory at Avon who worked in the time of the Firestones who still does the engraving to create the moulds for the embossing, and they've got the embossing machines. There's still one of the original Firestone Heidelberg machines that were imported from Germany that are there.
Still working?
I think it does. I don't think they use it, but I think it still works.
Because something that fascinates me about kind of embossing, for example, and the tactile nature of advertising, and it's something that's perhaps a connecting thread again between all three, is not just the tactile nature but the bespoke nature of advertising campaigns, which, as we've referenced earlier, had dropped out of fashion for quite a while. There was a cold, mass-produced digital aspect.
Yeah,
Talk to us about the bespoke and the handmade and the handcrafted, and what kind of resonance does that have?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in my career, I mean, my early career, you could get a client to agree to a foil or an emboss, and it would be expensive. But with the advent of digital printing, budgets seem to have completely kind of disappeared in terms of print material, and as a result, I think for many, many years, the print quality just looked very the same. So there was no cherishable quality about print pieces. You wouldn't hold on to them. You wouldn't archive them. There's things that I still have at home that that are from the 80s. They're so beautifully printed and they're archive quality. But anything that's been printed in the sort of late 90s and early noughties is, it's just you're just sort of low quality and really kind of throwaway culture. But certainly what we're seeing is a real sort of resurgence in those kind of cherishable qualities. So it's a distinction and it's I mean, you see it a lot in restaurants at the moment. So like you'll see this, like a beautiful business card that's got a lovely gold emboss or some sort of embellishment, and it just means that you hold on to it. You may put it in your wallet, or you may sort of take it home and put it with all of the other business cards that you quite like the look of. But I think that, I mean, digital media is also kind of involved with that. So for a long time, a lot of our clients were pushing their campaigns out on websites and digital ad banners, and then all of a sudden everyone's doing it. So there's no distinction from one to the next. So we're seeing this complete kind of turnaround where a piece that's cherishable and maybe has that kind of floggable quality, where, if you've got a really nice direct mail piece that's well printed and is elegant, you might want to pinch it off your co-worker's desk, or something like that. It catches your attention. And it's interesting how sort of disposable media or quick media has had an effect, but we're kind of coming back around again.
Well, I just, to pick up on the point, I think, the push towards digital advertising, you can see all of the appeal. You create the same item and it's you can replicate the same thing quickly and cheaply, but you sort of in that process lose the connection directly between the brands and the consumers as well. And I think if you think about some of the early kind of labels, product labels and trademarks and advertising, there's much more of a connection, I think, between the consumer and the brand in that sense. And there's something really authentic about that you can touch in your hand. I mean, as I said, I'm a legal historian. As a legal historian, to be able to actually touch an archive in 100 years' time, I'm not quite sure how somebody doing my job will be able to get the same kind of, it doesn't evoke the same kind of feeling or connection with consumers.
A lot of the digital print stuff is not even colour fast. So after a few weeks, the image is gone. You know, so it won't last. It won't last a year. So the sort of archivability of it is just not there. So.
And if you, just to go back to, I think, Trodal, but I think it's true of the Firestone collection as well. I mean, these works, a lot of the early advertisements were reproductions of artistic works. They were artwork with some text around it. They were worth preserving, and there was a real sort of muddling about, was this, you know, an artistic work, was it advertising, was it a label, what was the difference between all of those? But these sorts of works were considered to be worth preserving because there was some inherent artistic quality to them, which I don't think consumers would feel the same about something that is digital and they see on their Twitter feed.
Megan, anything to add?
I think the digital now, it's everywhere. It's on our phone, it's on our iPads, it's on the television, where previously it was like you might see a poster or something in the newspaper and then you'd go to the store of the counter and then see this beautiful object. So I think it was less saturated then, which made what you did produce even more important, and it had to be beautiful and it had to be eye-catching because that was your only chance at the counter for, am I going to choose this one or that one?
I find it fascinating that we've got essentially three separate evolutions in advertising. We've got the very earliest advertising when advertising wasn't even really advertising; it was something entirely new. Then we've got kind of that period pre kind of Mad Men, but in which advertising has become an actual kind of an established form and an established business, and it's being used to sell. It's being used to sell lifestyle as well as product. And now we've kind of here in the 21st century, when everyone is so suspicious of advertising, and we're also aware of what advertising is and how it tries to sell us, that it's kind of moved off in a different direction as well. For each of you, what do you think are the most successful elements or aspects of the advertising of which you're representing and speaking today?
Tough question. To be honest, if any of the kind of Triple R listeners feel like we're selling to them, that's when the campaign doesn't work. So I mean, going back to what I said earlier, if we're selling anything, we're selling a lifestyle or becoming part of a community. So, I mean, realistically, when our subscriber numbers are up, that's a great campaign for us. But I don't know that we can claim all the glory. There's such a sort of complicated system of why people subscribe. Sometimes economic downturn means more people subscribe to Triple R because they fear that they might lose their independent radio station. So whilst I might feel like it's a really successful campaign because subscriber numbers are up, there's a lot at play. But yeah, I think I will go back to my previous adage. If I see a poster torn down, that's a tick for us.
I would say with the Firestones, it's the topography, the colour and the imagery its key beauty and the 3D nature of what they are.
And the fact that some of the colour and imagery has not changed since works were made in the... I think there was the Milo kind of brand
We've got
in
it
there.
on display over there, a fantastic Milo, and the green, slight difference, but exactly the same topography and colour. Hasn't changed.
Much of those early labels, the basic fonts and colour schemes are much the same. So similarly in the Trodal archive, there's some labels for IXL and some other alcohol and wine products.
I mean, that's got to be a huge success when you've realised that what you've designed is actually, it's becoming part of people's psyche. So when you go to the supermarket and the Milo label is exactly the same, it's in much the same spot, and you're really just buying it. It's just like, I need some, and it's really automatic. So I mean, there's some really famous examples of brands that have changed a little too much, and no one can find the product on the shelf anymore. And it's in the same container. It's just maybe a slightly different colour, and those automated choices. I mean, if you can develop something like that where your design becomes part of that automatic choice, I think that's an incredible success of design, typography, marketing. Yeah, definitely.
What makes an iconic campaign, slogan, jingle, image? I mean, at Triple R, for example, we have a catchphrase that got reused for Radiothon just recently, the jewel and the junk heap. I even know the jingle. I can still I'm not going to try and sing it for you now. But it's embedded in my cultural memory because I've been involved with Triple R since '93. There are other Australian advertising campaigns or slogans, Aeroplane Jelly and so many others that we all know, whether consciously or subconsciously. So again, a question for all three of you, and I might start, Megan, with you, what are the elements that make an iconic or successful image or campaign or jingle or...
I would again go back to the colour and the topography and the production values of what they're doing. I think with the slides that were up there before, there's so many iconic companies who are still recognisable now that are represented in this collection. But I think it is to do with that recognition and association with childhood or culture or place. I think that's what makes it most successful.
I think that's right. I think it's the colour, it's the imagery, it's the aesthetic that has the appeal, and then the sell comes second. But it's the image that evokes something in somebody's memory. That's the thing that will be memorable and enduring, I think.
I think for the Radiothon campaign, the successes are really ownership. So personal ownership from the audience. So if we, say for instance, up the back there's the I Will Subscribe campaign, and we started seeing a lot of the Triple R audience making making items that tied into that theme. And so if we start seeing the audience posting images that link to that campaign, or they've designed a hashtag themselves that ties in. It's all of that add-on that we haven't created it, but it's got a life of its own. So if we start seeing the campaign jingle or the campaign line reused, that's a great success for us. And you really can't pay for that. You can't anticipate. Sometimes it can be the undoing of a campaign. So if it goes the wrong way, it just has a life of its own that you can't stop. But thankfully, the Triple R audience are very generous and generally get on board with the spirit of the campaign.
Please thank Amanda Scaramaglia, Megan Atkins, and Adele Smith. And I've been Richard Watts. You can catch me on air tomorrow on Triple R from 9 till 12.